G'day everyone, Dicko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. This is part 6 and the final video that covers an introduction to rigging. Today we are going to complete our rig with a little cleanup. Finally, we'll wrap things up by adding the control shapes. We're on the final stretch here, boys and girls, so let's send this one home. Alright, so as you may recall from the last video, we had set up our IK and FK and then attached a driver to switch these things on and off. So let's just demonstrate that again. So in this case, the IK, the FK is turned on. And if I turn on the layer with the IK, you can see that if I switch it off and on, it's all working. Alright, so basically now what we have to do is basically create the controllers. But before that, we need to do a bit of cleanup. The reason being is that when I was looking over the footage from last week, I noticed there was one little mistake with our joint orientation on our hand here. So if you can have a look here, notice how the orientation of this bone here is different to our hand and our the first bone of our rig here. So we need to reorient this bone so it aligns with the other ones. And the reason is pretty simple. I'll just demonstrate why that's the case. I'll just switch over to FK and I'll show you what I mean. So if I just select the FK bones and try and rotate now these three controllers along the local axes all together at the same time, you'll notice that the middle bone is rotating in the opposite direction of the other two bones. So I want them all to sort of curl forward, but the reason why it's not happening is because this bone has been misaligned with its orientation. So we need to fix that all with every bone that we have. So let's just quickly do that now. So all we have to do is open up all three layers, select these three bones in the center here, select any one of the bones here at the bottom here, and then we're going to realign the orientation of this joint here. So to do that, we're going to push Shift N, and then we're going to say recalculate roll to the active bone, so the last selected object. And there you go, the orientation has now been fixed. And now if you look at the FK curl, as we rotate it, it's now doing exactly what we want it to do. But now there's one more issue that we have now, because we've changed the bone roll on the IK as well. Notice what happens if I try to move the IK in the right direction. It might work, it might not work, but sometimes it might start flipping out. So let's just quickly have a look at that, make sure it's working. Alright, so that's fine. That's good to know. If it was the top bone, I think we would have to realign the roll on that as well. But that's all good now. That's all we needed to fix up. So now we can continue with the tutorial and get some shapes done. Alright, so how do we add shapes to our controllers? It's pretty simple really. It's just a matter of creating the shapes using basic modeling tools, and then attaching those objects as sort of like a reference point onto the bones. So to start, let's make a new collection and call this bone widgets. Widget, and I'm going to call it shapes. Bone widget shapes. And we're going to create our bone widget shapes inside of this collection, and then we're going to attach it onto the bones using the bone settings here. And if you go to viewport display, there's an object here that says custom object, and we're gonna link a custom object, being the shapes we create, to the bone using this little picker here. Alright, so there's a few things you need to know about how the creation of these shapes work, and I'm going to demonstrate that with a separate file so it's a little clearer to understand. So I've made a really simple demo file here. I've got a basic shape. So I've actually made just a basic mesh circle shape. I've moved that across temporarily. And I'm going to show you how to attach this shape to this bone, and what you will most likely come across when you first start doing this. So I'm going to turn on my viewport display on that shape and turn on axes to show you what's going on. Alright, so to create a controller, it's really straightforward. All you got to do is select the bone individually, and then go to select the bone, and then use the custom object operator, use the little eyedropper, and then eyedrop the shape. And now you'll notice that there's one thing that's wrong with this thing, is that it doesn't match the orientation of our bone. This bone shape doesn't match the orientation of our original shape here. And generally speaking, you want them to match just so it's easier to sort of make sure it works together. So the reason is pretty simple. If you look at the axes of our original bone, so if we just turn off the shape here, let's just get rid of that shape, you'll notice that the axes of this shape, this bone here, is with Y pointing up, Z pointing forward, and X pointing, towards X. Whereas the actual shape here, if we just jump out of object mode, the shape here, the axes are a little different. So Z is pointing up, Y is pointing back, and X is pointing along there. So there's quite a simple little solution here, because of the way that shapes work when referenced onto the bones, is that any shape changes that you make must be done in edit mode within the mesh object that you're using as a bone shape. So transforms don't really affect the orientation. So you can't just rotate this in object mode and expect it to change the orientation in the bone itself. So let me just demonstrate that. So if I just go back into the pose mode, I'll give that the shape again. Notice how if I rotate it in object mode, this doesn't change at all. So, but if I jump into edit mode and I start rotating it, it starts to change. This will come in handy once we start creating custom shapes. But the solution to sort of align this shape, or this shape to this shape, is to basically rotate our reference mesh to match the orientation of the bone that we're trying to transfer that shape to, if that makes sense. So notice how if I've rotated it, I'm just rotating this 90 degrees on the X. Notice how the orientation now matches. So X is pointing in the right direction, Y is pointing in the right direction, and Z is pointing in the right direction. So now all we have to do to make that sort of shape flat is to go into edit mode within our mesh and then just rotate that back 90 degrees to get that flat shape. And just to demonstrate how we can make custom shapes, it's pretty straightforward. If we go to edit mode again onto this mesh object and start moving verts around, notice how we can easily start to create custom bone shapes. That would be like a perfect sort of global center control, for instance. So that's basically how you make bone shapes in Blender and attach them to your armature. So let's put this to the test in a real rig and see how it looks. All right, so there's a few controllers that we kind of have to make. One is just a basic FK control for our bones here and our hands as our fingers here. One is a pole vector control, and another is a switch control, and then we have our global controls here. All right, so how about we start with the FK, since it's the most straightforward. So FKs, because they kind of just rotate, they're just basically rotational. Let's start with a very simple control. So we're going to make a simple circle. Oops, simple circle. And I want this control, I'm going to move that across, since transforms don't affect it all that much. I want to make a line go across the center line of our FK control, just so that when I do rotate this in any given sort of axis, I know that transforms have been applied to it. So within this control, I'm going to go into edit mode. I'm going to select these two verts, and then I'm just going to push F to fill that in, and it will automatically create an edge that links the two together. That's basically going to be my default FK control, and I'm going to call it in the outliner as WGT for widget underscore FK control .001, because there might be variants of that if we have to. Let's turn on the axis of this and show you what the axis looks like. So let's just go to axis in the viewport display, and I'm going to apply it to within the FK layer. So our FK controls, these three controls. I'm going to link it to these three controls, and we're going to make sure that that orientation works as well. So notice how Y is pointing up there, Z is pointing up in this direction. So we can assume that we have to rotate this control like that before we can start attaching it. And then in edit mode, we are going to rotate this widget flat, like so. And now it's just a matter of selecting the bones that we want to attach this to. One. Actually, we got the wrong layer, so let's make sure we got the right bone structure selected. So right now I got the IK selected by accident. Switch over to the FK control. So make sure you got the right label ones. So the FK, custom object select, custom object select, and one for the hand, and select that again. Now notice how the controls themselves are all different sizes. And the reason for that is because the control size on the rig is determined by the size of the bone itself. So there's a few ways we can fix this. One is that we create custom shapes for each and every FK bone. So as you can tell, we can, and then scale them appropriately. So we have to make two more of these FK objects and then link them appropriately. But there's a slightly quicker way of doing that, and we can actually change the scale. We can actually change the scale of these controls individually within the viewport display panel. So to do that, we're going to select the bone, go down to viewport display, and I'm going to switch the scale of the bone to say 0.5, and notice how that looks a lot more manageable as a controller. I might make that a little bit bigger, 0.3. I'm going to make this one 0.3 as well, and this one I might make it just a little bit smaller, 0.8. Alright, so this one's just a matter of sort of preference, but notice how the controls are sitting right at the base pivot of our joints. So if you prefer to have the controls sort of sit in the center of our sort of bones, it won't affect the pivot, but if you want to have the control sit up here or up here, we can do that by editing the object in edit mode of our reference shape. So to do that, we just jump into edit mode, and then we transform the actual mesh object verts up. Now notice that because we aligned our the orientation of our object in object mode to have Y up, transferring or translating the verts up the Y-axis affects it along the positive Y-axis of the bone as well. So we could just translate that up, And now you'll see it's a perfect sort of alignment. But notice here that this control now sits too far up. So we kind of have to create a second version of the widget here. So we're just going to create a second version of that, duplicate it, and we're going to call this FK control. I'm going to say FK control hand, just so I know that it's the right one. Right? And then in this bone, because you can swap out objects at any given time that you want, swap out the bone, and then we're going to remove the custom object and then add a new custom object, and then we're going to pick it from the outliner FK control hand.001. Didn't work. So that would work in 2.81. I just haven't updated it yet. So that would work in 2.81. So yeah, bear in mind. FK control hand.001. And now we're going to go into our object of our FK hand 001 and just bring that back down to sit at 0. And that works perfectly fine for me. And that's basically our FK controls ready. And now we can basically just hide these controls. But just for the sake of brevity, I might actually repurpose this control for our finger controls because they are also FK, but because they're a bit wider, I can turn this into an oval shape and then use those as FK controls. So with that in mind, I'm going to duplicate this widget. I'm going to call this second widget FK control fingers.001. I'm going to hide the original FK control hand widget. And then in the armature display, I'm going to turn on my original layers. And now we have a choice basically. So you can do this if you want to, but I'm not going to do it for this tutorial. But basically, if you want everything to have a specific controller bone that's being linked to a deformation bone, you can create a duplicate of these deformation bones and then use those duplicate bones as controllers. Or you can, because these are controlling only one thing, we can convert these, so to speak, into controllers. We'd have to rename them as control, but we can do that. Actually, I'm going to do that just to make you show you what I'm talking about. So we're going to select our fingers here. I'm going to go into edit mode and I'm going to duplicate those. Right? Because we duplicated them, it still has the same hierarchy as, it's still like parented to our hand joints. And then I'm going to move those to a fourth layer and give that layer, isolate that layer, and I'm going to rename these as control finger L.001 002. I'm going to give this control finger 001 and then one more 002, and then we're going to give this a custom shape, and then we're going to link these bones to the fingers as well. Alright, so to do that, we're going to go into our pose mode. We're going to select custom shape, and we're going to give the custom these bones the custom shape of FK control fingers.001. So we're just going to go pick it. I'm going to pick this one. Pick it. Oops, sorry. Pick that one. And then pick that one. You might be wondering why I'm doing this first. Before I link these finger controls to our object, our other bones. It's because it'll be easier to just sort of select the two bones at the same time. Alright, so you'll notice that because I like having this line facing along sort of the Z axis, or just so I could see how it's rotating along the X axis, I want to rotate this line so it faces this way. So first things first, let's select our bone here, our bone shape here. I'm going to select everything, and then I'm going to rotate that just 90 along the Z, 90 degrees. Make sure I put that back to global. And that looks a lot nicer to me. And then I'm going to squish it and then lift it up a little bit. So now we have some nice finger bone shapes. They look pretty cool. And if we rotate that along the X in local mode, you'll notice, along the Z, that's working pretty good. And if we now go into our other layer with our original fingers, we need to attach these bones. We need to attach these bones so they get influenced. So right now it's not doing anything. Notice how it's not doing anything. We need to attach these bones so it does. But I've also noticed that there's one thing that I'm a bit of a stickler for, is that I like to have the primary rotation sit along the X-axis, and right now it's sitting along the Z-axis. So let's quickly reorient those joints so X is facing inwards, so Z's facing inwards here. So this is another cleanup thing that I missed. So let's quickly select our bones here, all the bones, including, we're going to select those, and then I'm going to go into edit mode, go to item, bone roll, and I might switch that to 90 and hold Alt and enter, just so Z is pointing inwards here. And that looks a lot better. And because we had bone X-axis mirror turned on, it's done it for the other side as well. But again, notice how since we've changed the bone roll, the controller has also been flipped a little bit. So using our object, we're going to just flip this in the Z 90 degrees. And now everything's working pretty good. Alright, so what we need to do now is basically just add a copy transform constraint from our controller to our deformation joints. So let's do that now. So select the first object, then the second object, Control Shift C, copy transforms. And now these controls are working perfectly with our rig. The reason why I'm separating the controls from the deformation joints is basically for organizational reasons, and also because if we ended up having a more complicated rig where we had bones that are deforming and also working as controls, you start to get a bit confused as to what does what. So, you kind of want to keep things separate. You want to keep functionality separate. So controls being controls without really deforming, and deformed bones not being really controls. That's more of a sticking point for me. It's not really a convention. It's just something that I like to do. All right. So far we have had we've got our FK. All our FK controls are pretty much ready to go, and they're perfectly functional. So they're working really well. So as you can see, there they are. And if we turn on our switch onto FK, that's working just as we want it to. So we can basically hide our FK for now. And we will switch it back to IK on our switch. And let's get that IK out the way. So we have our IK joints. Let's just move this joint to our IK layer. All right, so let's just focus on our IK for now. So really, there's only two controls we need to do for the IK, and that one is a hand control, and the second one is a pole vector widget. These controls here, these bones here, aren't really going to be controlled directly, so we actually have to just hide these controls in our layer stack. So let's just hide these in a layer below our IK controls, just for organizational sake, and let us focus on these two controls. So to do that, let's create a simple circle for our IK control pole vector. And instead of using a mesh, let's use an empty. So, because empty already has some nice sort of controls for these sort of things. So in our case, I'm going to use a sphere empty. And it's just obviously been created wherever my 3D cursor was made. So let's just delete that and go to our 3D cursor and reset that. And create again a new empty with a sphere. Let's rename this as WGT widget pole vector .001, and we only need one of them. And then we're going to select our pole vector object there. We'll go down to custom object and just select that empty. And then we're just going to scale that down a bit, just so it's a bit less obtrusive. 0.5. So that's the first half of that IK one down out the way. And now we can just hide that. We don't need that anymore. And we can also hide this bone widget here as well. We can just hide that as well from the outliner. Alright, we only need one more bone for the IK. Here. So this one we can use do a more custom sort of object. So we can either make it look like a bit of a cup, like a half circle. And I think that'll look pretty cool. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to create a new circle. Mesh, that is. And then basically we're going to jump straight into edit mode for this one. I'm going to select all our bones here. Oops, sorry, all our vertices here. And then I'm just going to shrink that down. Actually, I might just delete these verts. So I'm just going to dissolve them, not delete them. So just X, dissolve verts. And then I'm going to fill that in. So you see there how there's a, because we dissolved it, there's actually a line there, an edge. So I'm just going to bring that back down like that. And that's our controller for our hand. And I might do a vert there and fill that as well. So this is how it looks like on its own. Looks like that. I feel that looks pretty cool. And now let's just select our bone, pose mode, select our contact, and as you can see, because the orientation is a bit funny, let's have a look at that. So let's turn on our axis. As you can see, we need to rotate that up so it matches our orientation there. And then I want to actually turn this around. So actually, the actual orientation is pretty good, to be honest. So I'm just going to bring that up, essentially. And then I'm going to shrink that down. Actually keep it centered. I'm going to widen that a little bit. Bring that down a little bit. 2, 3, and I might just bring that control down just a tad. And that's our IK controls out the way. So if we select it now in pose mode, working perfectly well. That's our IK out the way. Alright, so there's really only a couple controls left, and that is the base controls, essentially. So if we turn on the base control visibility, you'll see that we only have 2 joints left to go, and then we're good to go. So let's just do what we did before with the FK on the fingers, and we're going to duplicate those, and then we're also going to create shapes for it. But let's start with the shapes first. We have 2 shapes that we need to make. One is sort of like a global control shape, and then another one just for like the rotation of that base here. Alright, so let's see what we can do. Alright, so for the global control, I might just go with a square with a line through the center, and then I might add a little arrow at the end there as well. So let's start with just making that. I'm going to create a plane. I'm going to center that to our location here, and then the first thing we need to do is I'm going to turn off the grid as well, just so you see what's going on. Floor, I'm going to turn off my axes. I'm going to delete the face from the center here. I'm going to delete the face from the center here, and then just delete the face, but not the edges. So only delete only faces. So make sure you do that, and that way we'll keep our edges there. And then I'm going to subdivide those 2 lines, and then I'm going to fill that with a line down the center, and then I might subdivide that front face, that front edges there, subdivide, and then I'm going to bring those in, scale them in a little bit. Let's just turn off individual origins, scale those in, and then I'm going to extrude that out. I'm going to add a edge loop there. I'm going to then add a edge loop here and an edge loop there. I'm going to delete this and that face, and then I'm going to select all 4 things there, center, so we have an arrow basically, and then I'm going to delete these only faces. I made a mistake there. I'm going to fill those in, and then I'm going to just quickly delete these edges. And now what we have is a perfectly good global center control. Alright, so for this one, we're going to assign it to this tiny little bone here. But first, let's quickly duplicate these 2 bones in edit mode. I'm going to duplicate those, and then I'm going to move those to a 5th layer here, just so I can isolate them. I'm going to rename this as control base 01, and then I'm going to call this bottom one control. I'm going to call this one global, in this case global .001, because this will be what determines the location of the entire rig, essentially. So we have our base for rotation, and then we have the control for the global transformation of this. Alright, so let's start with assigning this control to this this bone. Alright, so let's go to custom object, control, and as you can see we have the same problem as before. So our orientation of Y is there. So let's have a look and see what we can do with this. Let's just go to our viewport display axis, turn that on. We're going to rotate that downwards so it matches. And here's a little trick we can do as well. So since transforms don't affect the scale of the actual control on the bone, we can actually scale down our reference object to approximately the same size of our bone, and then we can select our entire control widget in edit mode and then scale that back up just to see if it matches, and then we can then align that as needed. And as you can see, we now have a nice global control. Just make sure it sits right flush with the bottom of our rig there. And there we have it. We have a nice sort of oriented global control. Make sure you rename that widget as widget global .001, and now we can hide that. We have that control is good, and now we need to do one more for the rotation of our base here. So let's make a new control. Let's make sure that my 3D cursor is centered. And now let's make a new circle. I'm going to name this one as widget base .001, and then I'm simply just going to do what I showed in my other example from the start of the tutorial. I'm basically going to select these four pieces, and I'm just going to create like a simple star-like control for the rotation there, and that's our base control. So let's select our bone in pose mode, go to our custom object, select that, and now that's attached. Let's rotate this into place and sort of align it up just so we can estimate a size more accurately. And then let's scale that up. We're going to rotate that, and there we have it. We have our base control ready to go. All right, and now we can hide that. All right, let's just turn off wireframe preview, and we can see how all our controls work together. And we have one last thing to do with this rig, and that's attach these base controls to our deformation bones. So as you can see right now, these bones aren't doing anything at all. They're absolutely useless at the time at this time being. So let's quickly add a copy transforms onto this bone, and one more onto this bone. And now let's have a look how this all goes together. Way, all good. That's working well. This bone is doing its job. Let's see, rotating, perfect. And then we have our IKs working. This is working, and if we switch it over to FK, that's working. So all our controls are almost done except for our switch. So we need to finish it up with our switch, and then we're pretty much done. All right, so let's get that started. So this one's a little bit different because we have the switch bone, but we need to kind of create a container as well around that switch. So to create that container, we basically need to create a second bone that's really just there for, allowing us to have a shape on it, essentially. So to do that, we're going to go into edit mode. We're going to duplicate this bone, the switch bone, and then we're going to just active element. I'm going to scale that up. I'm going to rename this as ORG for organizational, FK or IK, FK, switch. I'm just gonna give it a label. Like, I might go organizational label. FKIK switch dot 001. All right. And there's a few things we need to do with this control. We need to remove its deformation. And then we're going to remove the constraint of limit location because we don't want this to move at all. So we're basically going to lock off its entire transforms completely. And because we duplicated it from our base switch here, it's basically already parented to the right bone. So we don't need to worry about that. But we need to create a basic container. So for this one, we need to actually create the label with the text FIK to FK switch and then have a box around it. So let's just do that quickly now. So let's create go into object mode. We're going to select create text. And then we're going to give it the label, basically tab into the text to be able to edit it. FIK to FK switch. All right, let's put that aside for now. And then we're going to create a mesh plane. We're going to do the same as what we did before. But this time we're just going to leave it without any other lines in it. So we're just going to delete the face only faces. And then we're going to bring this down and then place that just above here. So we have a label. All right, perfect. And then we're going to right click and select convert to mesh. So that way it's now a mesh. And then we're going to select everything and then delete the faces, only faces. And then we're going to merge this mesh to this mesh here. So select this mesh, then the second mesh, and then Control J to join. And now we have our box container essentially for our FKIK switch. We're going to rename this as widget FKIK to FK switch .001. And then we're going to select our container bone here, and we're going to select the custom object. Oops. And there we go. We got our switch going on there. Let's rotate that in the right orientation, just like we did before. I'm going to align that up so it kind of matches. Doesn't have to be perfect. And then I'm going to go into edit mode, select everything. Make sure you got edit mode in the object itself, and then rotate that in opposite direction. Oops, I'm going to change it to bounding box. Rotate X, and then we're going to bring that down, and then we're going to just test using pose mode. We're going to test to see the bounds of that box. So pretty close, but because we're moving basically +1, let's try and get this box aligned more accurately. So we're going to select our switch in object mode. I'm going to bring that across to around there, so at least then in pose mode, just about there. We're just going to bring that object a little bit smaller. So let's bring it to there. Let's see how that looks. That looks about right. Cool. And then we're just going to add a circle to that controller there. So we'll add a new circle. mesh circle, and we'll rename this one as widget IK FK switch O2. That'll do. And then custom object, select the circle, and then we're gonna just basically scale that down. So we have a nice neat control. As you can see, we're just gonna rotate that so it's flat. Let's just bring that in, sort of align that. Rotate X. Alright. We're going to shrink that down like so we can actually just make it a bit more manageable. And as you can see, this other switch is a bit too high up, so we're going to bring that back down. And there we have it. We have our switches and labels all set up. And let's turn off our axes. Let's have a look. That's everything we need to do. So now everything's working as we want to. So if we were to go into start animating it, we basically can do that now. Let's turn on the other layer in our panel. Oh, yeah, there's our FK, there's our IK there. And if we switch on the IK and now move around the IK, that's working really well. And as you can see, all the deform bones are moving in tandem with each other. That looks pretty good. That's the rig done. The only thing left to do is a little bit of housekeeping, and we can add some colors to this too. So let's start with the colors. So generally speaking, I like to keep my IK as red, my FK as blue, and any other global controls as yellow. So let's start with the global controls. We can select our global controls here, all these controls here, and then I'm going to go down to bone groups, and I'm going to add a bone group. I'm going to give it the name global. I'm going to change the default color to yellow, and then I'm going to push assign to the selected bones, and they turn yellow. And then I'm going to select my FK controls. I'm going to give it a new group, FK. I'm going to give it the color blue, assign. I'm going to give my IK a color red, and then if I want to, because it's fun, let's add a, let's just rename that one as IK. Let's rename a second one for fingers. I'll select those finger bones here and give it the assignment of, I don't know, pink. Actually, let's make them green. And there we go. We basically have our rig is almost ready to go. Now there's a few housekeeping things I like to do. One is that I want to make sure that all my deformation bones are on a single layer. So in this case, I'm going to select these deformation bones. So all our deform bones with the prefix DEF. I'm going to move those to a single layer. So if we ever had to do any changes to our weight painting, we know that all these bones here are responsible for the deformation influence of our rig. And this is why it's really good to have all your controls sort of separate from your deformation bones, because now if you ever have to make those changes, you don't have to worry about everything else. You just got them all here. All right. The next thing we want to do, I want to bring all my global controls together into one group. So in this case, it would be these controls plus these controls. I want to keep them all as a layer onto themselves. So I'm going to give them on layer 1. So in layer 1, I know that my switches and my global controls are all there. My FK is already pretty good to go. They're all on the same layer. My IK is all on the same layer. And then I got fingers as the same layer. So if I select all of them now, I can now basically work with that as a completed rig. I've kept the, and if you have any miscellaneous sort of mechanical bones, I like to sort of group them in a layer that's associated with, but not directly on the same layer. So all my IK mechanical stuff that we're not going to be actually animating with, these are on a layer underneath the actual IK controls. That way I know that they're kind of associated with one another. All right, there's one last thing we need to do, and that's with the actual controls. We need to lock off any transforms that we don't want to use, and then we need to also make sure that these can't be influenced as deform bones, because if you ever have to say redo your weight paints, you don't want to accidentally have these bones influence the mesh. So to do that, we're going to select all our bones. We're going to go to our bone setting here and see how deform is checked on. This means that if we had automatic weights turned on when we attached our mesh to our rig, these bones would end up actually influencing the mesh as well as our original deformation bones. So we want to turn that off. So to turn it off across the entire board, hold down Alt on your keyboard and then select Deform, and it should just turn off across the board. No, didn't work. If that's not working, just turn them off individually. Just make sure they're all off, including the mechanical bones on the IK. So those ones off, just make sure they're all off. Yep, that one's off. Those are on. Let's turn those off. All right, cool. So let's make sure everything is zeroed out. So we don't need to have, now we need to just lock off all the transforms of these objects that we don't want to have any control over. So in this case, we just need with the switch, we don't need to have rotation or scale enabled. So we're going to lock off everything there. Same with the switch, we're going to turn off everything because we don't need to actually manipulate that switch. That's just there for labeling purposes. And then with the global, because it is a global control, we're going to keep it as is. With this control, it's already been locked off because we locked it off earlier in the tutorial, but that's good to go. With the IK control, FK controls, we need to lock off the location here. We need to lock off anything else. No, that's all good. We can keep the scale enabled, but let's just lock those off as well because we don't really want to have to enable the scale here. So lock those off across the board, lock those off, and lock those off. We want to, in this case, lock off this bone here. These bones have to be locked off completely as well along the Y and Z, because we just want them to rotate along the X. So we're going to switch the rotation order to XYZ Euler on both of these. And then we're going to lock off the Y and Z, so that way we can't accidentally rotate along the X. So there we go. There's only one rotation that we can work with now in this one. And that's the same here. With the end joint here, we can kind of keep that free. So I'm just going to keep it to XYZ, but I'm not going to lock off everything here because it's still a wrist joint and we want it to influence everything. So if I turn on the FK here, I kind of want to have that freedom still. So that's all good. With our IK, we'll just lock off the scale, but everything else should be good to go. And then again, with the fingers, let's switch it all to XYZ, 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 XYZ. And then we're gonna lock off Y and Z lock off Y and Z, lock off Y and Z. And you may be starting to realize why I like to have all my orientation, my primary rotations to be along the X, because it makes organizing all this sort of stuff a lot easier to understand, because suddenly I'm not having to think about, oh, do I have to lock up my Y and X, or, you know, do I have to lock off my Z only? No, I just have to lock off Y and Z, Y and Z, Y and Z, and it all works as planned. So, as you can see, perfectly rotating together along the X. Alright, to finish off, that's pretty much it. We just got to hide these controls in our layers. So just deselect that, and we have officially finished our rig. And as you can see, it's pretty damn good. And we can animate with this really easily now. Everything is as it's meant to be. Everything scales properly, it all rotates properly. Then we have our base control, which rotates everything properly here along the Y. We got rotations on the X. Our fingers all move, and then we got our switch. We can turn on our IK. And here we go, perfectly working rig. So that's all we need to do for this rig. And now if you want to start animating with this thing, go ahead. You're free to do so. Okay, so this is the last video of this series, and the last video of this year for me. I'll be overseas for a few weeks. But when we get back, I've got some crazy stuff coming up. So I hope you subscribe, like, and share this video, because next year it's going to be nuts. So until then, catches.